In the autumn of 1924, 17 families from across New England sent their troubled daughters to what appeared to be the most prestigious finishing school in America. The Willowbrook Academy for young ladies promised to transform wayward girls into perfect wives and mothers through revolutionary educational methods that combined modern psychology with traditional feminine virtues. The enrollment fee was staggering, $5,000 per student, equivalent to over $70,000 today. But desperate families paid willingly for the promise of social salvation. By Christmas of that same year, only 9 girls remained at the academy. The other 8 had simply vanished. When concerned parents demanded answers, they received elegant letters explaining that their daughters had suffered tragic accidents during supervised nature walks, succumbed to sudden illnesses despite the best medical care, or in 2 cases, had run away in the night, leaving behind all their possessions and never making contact with their families again. Each explanation was accompanied by detailed medical reports, witness statements from staff, and personal effects returned with heartbreaking notes of condolence. What those grieving families never knew was that beneath the Academy's pristine Georgian mansion lay a network of underground chambers where their daughters had become subjects in experiments that challenged the very definition of human consciousness. The true purpose of Willowbrook Academy wasn't education. It was the systematic exploration of how completely a human personality could be dismantled and rebuilt according to someone else's design. Tonight, we reveal the buried truth about an institution that operated for nearly a decade under the protection of social respectability and scientific ambition. This isn't just another story of institutional abuse. It's a methodical investigation into how the pursuit of perfect womanhood became a nightmare of psychological engineering that left survivors questioning the very nature of their own identity. Before we descend into the shadows of Willowbrook Academy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you're ready to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Comment below and let us know what state you're watching from. Join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. Now let's uncover what really happened behind the ivy-covered walls of New England's most exclusive finishing school. The story begins not with the academy itself, but with the social anxiety that created the demand for its services. The 1920s had unleashed forces that terrified traditional American families. Women demanding the vote, daughters cutting their hair and shortening their skirts, wives working outside the home and challenging their husband's authority. The modern girl, with her jazz music and cigarettes and scandalous opinions about marriage and motherhood, represented everything that threatened the established social order. Into this cultural panic stepped Dr. Helena Fitzgerald, a woman whose credentials seemed perfectly designed to address the crisis of feminine rebellion that was consuming respectable families across the nation. The America of 1924 was a nation caught between competing visions of womanhood. The 19th Amendment had granted women the vote 4 years earlier, but the social transformation that followed challenged every assumption about feminine nature and proper behavior. Young women who had once accepted arranged marriages and domestic confinement were demanding education, careers, and personal autonomy that their mothers could barely comprehend. This generational conflict was particularly acute among the wealthy families of New England, where social position depended on maintaining rigid standards of respectability that seemed increasingly impossible to enforce. Daughters who had been raised in mansions with servants and private tutors were rejecting their predetermined roles as society wives, choosing instead to pursue higher education, artistic careers, or worse still, romantic relationships with unsuitable men who valued their minds over their dowries. The problem was especially pronounced in Boston, Hartford, and Providence, where old money families found themselves struggling to control daughters who had been exposed to progressive ideas through their expensive educations. These were not working-class girls rebelling against poverty and limitation. These were privileged young women who had every material advantage, but still refused to accept their prescribed place in society. Dr. Helena Fitzgerald understood this crisis intimately because she had lived through her own version of it decades earlier. Born Helena Morrison in 1878 to a prominent Philadelphia family, she had been among the first generation of women to attend medical school. Graduating from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1902 with highest honors and a reputation for brilliant insights into the female mind and nervous system. Her early career had been marked by innovative research into what was then called feminine hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis used to explain any behavior in women that deviated from expected norms of docility and compliance. Unlike her male colleagues who typically treated such conditions with rest cures and isolation, Dr. Fitzgerald developed what she termed reconstructive psychology, a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating the specific thoughts and behaviors that made women unsuitable for their natural roles as wives and mothers. Her methods were considered revolutionary because they were based on careful scientific observation rather than moral judgment. Dr. Fitzgerald didn't simply condemn rebellious behavior. She studied it with the detached curiosity of a naturalist examining a fascinating but dangerous species. Her published papers describe techniques for mapping individual personality structures, identifying the specific mental patterns that produced undesirable traits, and developing targeted interventions to modify those patterns permanently. The medical establishment initially received her work with enthusiasm. Here was a woman physician who understood the female mind from the inside, who could speak to patients in ways that male doctors couldn't, and who had developed apparently scientific methods for solving the growing problem of feminine rebellion. Her techniques promised to preserve the appearance of treating mental illness while actually achieving the social control that families desperately wanted. By 1920, Dr. Fitzgerald had established herself as the nation's leading expert on feminine psychological disorders. Her private practice in Boston attracted wealthy families from across the country who brought their difficult daughters for consultation and treatment. Her success rate was remarkable. Nearly 90% of her patients returned home as model examples of proper feminine behavior, quiet and compliant, and seemingly grateful for the transformations they had undergone. What made Dr. Fitzgerald's approach particularly appealing to anxious families was her emphasis on education rather than punishment. She didn't propose to break rebellious spirits through harsh discipline or moral instruction. Instead, she offered to re-educate wayward daughters, teaching them to understand their own minds and choose proper behavior through enlightened self-interest rather than external compulsion. The concept of the Willowbrook Academy emerged from Dr. Fitzgerald's observation that individual treatment, while effective, was limited in scope and efficiency. The most troubled cases required months of intensive intervention that was both expensive and logistically complicated. Moreover, she had begun to develop theories about the benefits of treating multiple patients simultaneously, creating controlled social environments where reform behavior could be reinforced through peer influence and group dynamics. In 1923, Dr. Fitzgerald purchased a magnificent estate in the hills outside Hartford, Connecticut, 200 acres of pristine New England landscape dominated by a Georgian mansion that had been built by a railroad magnate in the 1890s. The location was perfect for her purposes, isolated enough to ensure privacy, but close enough to major cities to attract wealthy clientele who valued both discretion and convenience. The transformation of the estate into an educational institution required extensive modifications that Dr. Fitzgerald supervised with meticulous attention to detail. The mansion's grand public spaces were converted into classrooms and common areas, designed to project an atmosphere of refined learning and cultural sophistication. The private quarters were redesigned as individual student rooms that combined the comfort expected by wealthy families with the security features necessary for maintaining complete control over the residents. Most significantly, Dr. Fitzgerald ordered the construction of extensive basement facilities that she described to contractors as specialized treatment rooms for students requiring intensive individual attention. These underground chambers were built to her exact specifications, with reinforced walls, sophisticated ventilation systems, and electrical installations that seem far more complex than would be needed for simple counseling sessions. Section 3. Character Introduction and False Security. Dr. Helena Fitzgerald presented herself to the world as the embodiment of everything that modern womanhood could achieve, while remaining perfectly respectable. At 46, she possessed the kind of elegant beauty that spoke of good breeding and expensive education. Silver hair arranged in the sophisticated styles favored by society matrons. Clothing that was clearly custom-tailored by the finest dressmakers, and a manner of speaking that reflected both authority and refinement. Her credentials were impeccable, and extensively documented. Medical degree from one of the nation's most prestigious institutions, advanced training in European clinics where she had studied the latest developments in psychological treatment, published research that had earned recognition from colleagues throughout America and abroad. She moved comfortably in the highest social circles, attending charity galas and cultural events where she was sought out by influential women who valued her insights into the challenges of raising daughters in an increasingly complex world. What made Dr. Fitzgerald particularly compelling to anxious families was her ability to discuss their daughters' problems with both scientific authority and maternal understanding. She didn't judge rebellious behavior as moral failure or character weakness. She explained it as the natural result of young minds being exposed to influences they weren't yet mature enough to process properly. Her approach was both reassuring and sophisticated, offering hope for transformation without the shame that typically accompanied admissions of family problems. During initial consultations, Dr. Fitzgerald would spend hours with both parents and daughters, conducting what she described as comprehensive psychological assessments designed to identify the specific factors contributing to undesirable behavior. These sessions were conducted in her elegantly appointed Boston office, where medical diplomas and scholarly awards created an atmosphere of professional competence, while comfortable furniture and expensive artwork suggested the kind of refinement that wealthy families expected. Her diagnostic process was remarkably thorough and seemingly scientific. She would ask detailed questions about family history, educational background, social influences, and personal interests, taking extensive notes in a leather-bound journal while maintaining the kind of intense focus that made her subjects feel both important and understood. She paid particular attention to what she termed environmental factors: the books her patients read, the friends they kept, the ideas they had been exposed to through their educations or social contacts. What parents found most impressive was Dr. Fitzgerald's ability to explain their daughter's problems in terms that made perfect sense while avoiding any suggestion of moral judgment or family failure. A girl who refused to consider marriage wasn't selfish or immoral. She had simply been exposed to unrealistic expectations about feminine independence that conflicted with her natural psychological development. A daughter who challenged her father's authority wasn't disrespectful. She was struggling to reconcile competing messages about proper behavior that had created confusion about her proper role in the family structure. Dr. Fitzgerald's explanations were invariably accompanied by detailed treatment plans that addressed each patient's specific needs through carefully designed educational programs. These weren't punitive measures designed to break rebellious spirits, but sophisticated interventions that would help young women understand their own minds and choose appropriate behavior through enlightened self-interest rather than external compulsion. The Willowbrook Academy represented the culmination of Dr. Fitzgerald's educational philosophy, a residential institution where troubled daughters could receive intensive treatment in an environment specifically designed to support their psychological transformation. The Academy's promotional materials, printed on expensive paper and illustrated with elegant photographs of the estate, described a revolutionary approach to feminine education that combined traditional academic subjects with modern psychological techniques. Students at Willowbrook would receive individual attention from qualified instructors while living in a carefully structured community that reinforced proper social behavior through positive peer influence. The curriculum included not only conventional subjects like literature, history, and languages, but also specialized courses in domestic arts, social etiquette, and what Dr. Fitzgerald termed psychological hygiene, systematic training in understanding and controlling one's own mental processes. The Academy's staff consisted of carefully selected professionals who shared Dr. Fitzgerald's commitment to scientific approaches to feminine education. Miss Margaret Whitmore, the academic director, was a graduate of Bryn Mawr College who had spent 5 years studying progressive education methods in Switzerland before joining the Willowbrook faculty. Her responsibilities included overseeing the traditional academic curriculum and ensuring that students maintained appropriate intellectual development while undergoing psychological treatment. Dr. James Bradford served as the Academy's medical director, a position that involved monitoring students' physical health while supporting Dr. Fitzgerald's psychological interventions. A graduate of Harvard Medical School with additional training in European and psychiatric institutions, Dr. Bradford brought both impeccable credentials and extensive experience in treating nervous disorders in young women. His presence on the staff provided additional reassurance to families who wanted to ensure their daughters would receive proper medical supervision throughout their educational experience. The Academy's daily routine was designed to create an atmosphere of refined learning while maintaining the kind of structured environment that Dr. Fitzgerald believed was essential for psychological transformation. Students rose at 7 for private meditation and reflection, followed by communal breakfast, where they practiced appropriate social conversation under staff supervision. The morning hours were devoted to traditional academic subjects taught in small classes that allowed for individual attention and careful monitoring of each student's intellectual development. Afternoons were reserved for specialized instruction in domestic arts and social skills, courses that prepared students for their future roles as wives and hostesses while reinforcing appropriate feminine behavior through practical application. Evenings included supervised recreational activities, cultural programs, and individual counseling sessions where students could discuss their progress with qualified staff members. What made the Willowbrook experience particularly appealing to families was the Academy's emphasis on treating students as mature young women rather than children requiring discipline. The rules were presented as guidelines for community living rather than arbitrary restrictions, and students were encouraged to participate in discussions about their own educational goals and treatment plans. This approach created an atmosphere of collaboration and mutual respect that seemed far more sophisticated than the harsh disciplinary methods typically used in reform institutions. The physical environment supported this philosophy of enlightened treatment through thoughtful design that combined elegance with functionality. Student rooms were individually decorated and furnished with personal possessions that created a sense of home rather than institutional confinement. Common areas included comfortable libraries, well-equipped music rooms, and spacious lounges where students could gather for informal socializing under discreet staff supervision. Parents who visited the Academy during the admission process invariably left with impressions of an institution that exceeded their highest expectations for their daughter's treatment and education. The combination of Dr. Fitzgerald's scientific authority, the staff's obvious competence and dedication, and the Academy's atmosphere of refined learning created exactly the kind of environment that wealthy families believed would transform their troubled daughters into the perfect young women they had always wanted them to become. The first warning came from Thomas Henley, a local tradesman delivering medical supplies to Willowbrook in November 1924. Arriving early that Tuesday morning, he heard sounds from beneath the mansion that made his blood freeze, screaming unlike anything he had ever encountered. Not cries of pain, but something worse. Voices pleading in fragmented, incoherent words, as if the speakers were losing the ability to form complete thoughts. When Henley mentioned this to Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the Academy's cook, her face went pale. She quickly explained that some students suffered severe nervous conditions requiring intensive medical treatment, but her hands shook as she spoke, and she kept glancing toward the basement windows with obvious fear. What Henley didn't know was that Mrs. Morrison had been documenting disturbing patterns for months. Students who entered what staff called intensive sessions emerged fundamentally changed, silent, compliant, moving with mechanical precision. More troubling, these transformed girls often seemed unable to recognize staff members they had known for weeks, as if their memories had been selectively erased. Of the 17 students enrolled in September, 8 had simply vanished by December. Their rooms were quietly emptied during the night while staff were instructed never to discuss their departures. The remaining 9 displayed personality changes so dramatic they seemed like entirely different people, responding to questions with rehearsed phrases devoid of personal thought. Mrs. Morrison's breaking point came when she discovered blood-stained clothing in the laundry, garments belonging to students who had supposedly left to return home. When she brought this to Dr. Bradford's attention, his reaction was swift and threatening. He explained that advanced psychological treatments occasionally cause minor physical symptoms, and warned that her continued employment depended on complete discretion about the Academy's operations. Despite these threats, Mrs. Morrison began keeping a secret journal, documenting everything she observed. Her handwritten records would later reveal a systematic pattern of deception and abuse hidden behind the facade of progressive education. The truth about Willowbrook Academy was far more horrific than even Mrs. Morrison suspected. Dr. Helena Fitzgerald had not created an educational institution. She had established a sophisticated laboratory for human experimentation that pushed psychological manipulation beyond anything attempted in legitimate medical research. The basement chambers were equipped with apparatus combining surgical techniques with experimental technologies Fitzgerald had developed through years of unrestricted research. The primary chamber contained a modified dental chair with restraints designed to immobilize patients completely while leaving their heads accessible for precise intervention. Fitzgerald's procedures were based on her theory that human personality was merely a collection of neural pathways that could be systematically modified through targeted physical intervention. Using techniques decades ahead of mainstream medicine, she had developed methods for accessing specific brain regions through calculated entry points that left minimal external scarring while allowing extensive internal manipulation. The process began with psychological mapping, detailed examinations identifying specific personality traits and behaviors to be eliminated. Students underwent extensive testing revealing their fears, desires, and emotional attachments with scientific precision. This information developed individualized treatment plans targeting neural structures supporting undesirable characteristics. The actual procedures were conducted under partial sedation, leaving patients conscious but unable to resist. Fitzgerald needed subjects responsive to monitor intervention effects in real time, asking questions and giving commands to determine which brain regions controlled specific thoughts and behaviors. Patients were fully aware of what was happening, but powerless to prevent it. Psychological torture often more devastating than the physical damage. Fitzgerald's documentation was extraordinarily detailed and methodical. Each file contained precise anatomical drawings showing surgical intervention locations, detailed procedure descriptions, and careful observations about resulting changes in personality, memory, and cognitive function. These records revealed systematic human experimentation that was scientifically rigorous and morally horrific. The experiments fell into distinct categories testing different theories about brain structure and behavior relationships. Memory modification procedures eliminated specific recollections while leaving other functions intact. Personality alterations suppressed traits like intellectual curiosity or independent thinking while preserving basic social skills. The most extreme interventions created perfect compliance, psychological states where patients accepted any instruction without question. Students who graduated and returned to families were living proof of Fitzgerald's success, though families interpreted dramatic personality changes as successful education rather than systematic brain damage. These young women became model daughters, displaying none of their previous rebellious tendencies. Quiet, compliant, apparently content with traditional roles they had once rejected. But families celebrating these transformations never understood what had been sacrificed. Their daughters had been stripped of everything, making them unique individuals. Curiosity, creativity, passionate interests, and capacity for independent thought systematically eliminated through procedures irreversibly damaging their ability to experience full human consciousness. Students who disappeared were victims of experiments beyond Fitzgerald's control. Some died during procedures too invasive for survival. Others were left in vegetative states unsuitable for family return. A few experienced complete psychological breaks, reduced to barely functional creatures maintained under constant supervision. The facade protecting Fitzgerald's operations crumbled in February 1925, when Charles and Eleanor Pemberton arrived unannounced to surprise their daughter Charlotte with engagement news. They expected to find her excited about marriage and grateful for educational transformation. Instead, they encountered a young woman with no memory of previous ambitions, family relationships, or basic life facts. Charlotte greeted her parents with polite courtesy, but no recognition, addressing them with formal manners reserved for strangers. She displayed no emotional response to engagement news, accepting it with mechanical compliance. When her mother discussed wedding plans, Charlotte responded with rehearsed phrases about feminine duty that sounded like textbook recitations rather than personal feelings. Fitzgerald explained Charlotte's condition as successful psychological treatment, eliminating mental disorders that had made her unsuitable for marriage. But the Pembertons noticed physical evidence suggesting surgical procedures. Recently cut hair concealing healing scalp incisions and neurological symptoms Charles Pemberton, himself a physician, recognized as brain trauma rather than psychological treatment. When Fitzgerald refused immediate student removal, citing continued treatment needs, Charles threatened legal action. Fitzgerald produced documents Charlotte had supposedly signed, giving the Academy complete medical authority. But Charles identified discrepancies proving forgery and handwriting analysis showing someone else had created Charlotte's signature while she was incapacitated. Armed with fraud evidence and convinced of systematic abuse, Charles contacted Connecticut State Police on February 16, 1925. Detective Captain Robert Hayes arrived February 18th with search warrants for the entire estate. When Fitzgerald refused basement access, claiming medical confidentiality, Hayes obtained additional warrants overriding privacy claims. The basement search revealed evidence exceeding investigators' worst expectations. Underground facilities contained fully equipped surgical theaters with cranial procedure apparatus, laboratories for preserving biological specimens, and documentation providing detailed human experimentation records spanning nearly 2 years. Most shocking was a hidden chamber containing preserved remains of 8 students, supposedly returned home or transferred elsewhere. Bodies showed clear cranial surgical evidence, some displaying multiple procedures conducted over extended periods. Preservation methods suggested ongoing study rather than accidental death disposal. Fitzgerald's experimental records discovered in a concealed safe documented systematic torture and murder of students whose families had entrusted them for education. Files contained detailed procedure descriptions, testing human consciousness limits, mapping brain structure and personality relationships through methods treating young women as laboratory animals rather than human beings deserving basic dignity. The arrest of Dr. Helena Fitzgerald on February 20th, 1925, triggered a scandal that New England's most prominent families desperately tried to suppress. The discovery of systematic human experimentation at Willowbrook Academy threatened to expose not just the crimes themselves, but the willingness of wealthy parents to sacrifice their daughters' humanity for the promise of social compliance. Dr. James Bradford was found dead in his Boston apartment 3 days after the Academy's exposure, an apparent suicide accompanied by a rambling confession that detailed his complicity in procedures he described as advancing medical science through necessary sacrifices. His death eliminated the prosecution's key witness and raised disturbing questions about whether other collaborators might escape justice through similar means. The surviving students presented investigators with an unprecedented challenge. 9 young women remained at the academy when it was raided, all showing clear evidence of neurological damage that had fundamentally altered their personalities and cognitive abilities. Medical examinations revealed surgical modifications to their brains that had eliminated specific memories, suppressed particular emotional responses, and restructured their capacity for independent thought. Charlotte Pemberton became the tragic symbol of Willowbrook's victims. Despite months of treatment by leading neurologists, she never recovered her memories of family, friends, or personal history. The brilliant young woman who had dreamed of becoming a physician was gone forever, replaced by a compliant stranger who required constant supervision and showed no interest in anything beyond basic domestic tasks. Her parents spent fortunes seeking treatment that might restore their daughter's personality, but the surgical damage proved irreversible. The other survivors faced equally devastating futures. Mary Thornton, once a talented musician who had composed her own pieces, could no longer read music or remember ever playing piano. Elizabeth Morse, who had been passionate about literature and poetry, showed no recognition when presented with books she had previously treasured. Each family confronted the horrible reality that their daughters' essential selves had been deliberately destroyed in the name of feminine reform. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the systematic nature of Fitzgerald's crimes, while exposing the complicity of institutions and individuals who had enabled her work. Bank records showed that prominent families had paid over $200,000 to have their daughters reformed at Willowbrook, money that had funded sophisticated experimental equipment and research facilities that rivaled anything available at legitimate medical institutions. More disturbing still, correspondence discovered in Fitzgerald's files revealed an extensive network of physicians, researchers, and academic institutions who had purchased her experimental data. Universities throughout America and Europe had unknowingly incorporated research based on systematic human torture into their medical curricula. Surgical techniques being taught to new generations of doctors were derived from procedures that treated young women as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. The families of Willowbrook's victims faced an agonizing choice between seeking justice and protecting their reputations. Public acknowledgement that their daughters had been subjected to horrific experimentation would expose them to social scandal and destroy their standing in communities where respectability was more valuable than truth. Most chose silence, preferring to live with private grief rather than public shame. This conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of Fitzgerald's crimes was never officially acknowledged. The prosecution, recognizing that wealthy families would never testify about their daughter's victimization, negotiated a plea agreement that resulted in Fitzgerald's commitment to a private mental institution rather than a public trial that would have exposed the broader network of complicity surrounding her work. Fitzgerald herself showed no remorse for her actions, maintaining until her death in 1943 that her research had advanced human understanding of consciousness and behavioral modification in ways that would ultimately benefit society. In final interviews with psychiatrists, she expressed frustration that her work had been interrupted before she could complete studies that might have solved the problem of feminine rebellion once and for all. The Willowbrook Academy building was sold to private developers who demolished it completely, ensuring that no physical trace remained of the horrors that had occurred there. The estate's grounds were subdivided into residential lots where wealthy families built homes without ever learning about the torture chambers that had once operated beneath their manicured lawns. Official records of the Willowbrook investigation were sealed by court order and deposited in state archives with instructions that they remain classified for 75 years. This legal suppression ensured that Fitzgerald's victims would be forgotten by history, their suffering erased to protect the reputations of families and institutions that had enabled systematic abuse through willful ignorance and social prejudice. The medical community's response to the Willowbrook revelations was equally disappointing. Rather than confronting the ethical implications of research that had violated every principle of human dignity, professional organizations quietly implemented new guidelines while refusing to acknowledge that their previous standards had been inadequate to prevent systematic torture disguised as legitimate medical practice. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the cook whose documentation had helped expose Fitzgerald's crimes, was rewarded for her courage with social ostracism and employment difficulties that lasted for years. Families who had trusted Willowbrook with their daughter's welfare blamed her for exposing truths they preferred to ignore, treating her as a troublemaker rather than a hero who had risked everything to protect innocent victims. The broader implications of the Willowbrook scandal extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case revealed how easily scientific authority could be used to justify systematic abuse, how social prejudices could blind communities to obvious signs of criminal behavior, and how institutional complicity could protect perpetrators while silencing victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the conspiracy of silence that followed Fitzgerald's exposure demonstrated society's willingness to suppress uncomfortable truths rather than confront the implications of systematic abuse. The families, medical professionals, and government officials who chose secrecy over justice ensured that similar crimes might occur again, protected by the same combination of social respectability and willful ignorance that had enabled Willowbrook's horrors. The story of Willowbrook Academy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of scientific progress and the price we're willing to pay for social control. Dr. Helena Fitzgerald's systematic torture of young women was enabled not by some uniquely evil personality, but by a society that valued feminine compliance over individual humanity and trusted scientific authority over moral intuition. The families who sent their daughters to Willowbrook weren't monsters. They were loving parents desperate to help children who seemed lost in a rapidly changing world. Their tragic mistake was believing that institutional respectability and professional credentials could guarantee ethical treatment, that impressive facilities and sophisticated methods must necessarily serve benevolent purposes. This willingness to trust authority over evidence, to prioritize social conformity over individual welfare, remains as dangerous today as it was in 1925. How many modern institutions operate behind facades of scientific rigor while pursuing goals that serve power rather than human flourishing? How often do we ignore obvious signs of systematic abuse because acknowledging them would threaten our comfortable assumptions about the world? The medical professionals who collaborated with Fitzgerald, whether knowingly or through willful ignorance, represent a pattern that extends far beyond historical curiosity. The pursuit of knowledge divorced from ethical constraints, the willingness to sacrifice vulnerable populations for abstract benefits, the institutional protection of prestigious colleagues over unknown victims. These dynamics continue to shape how research is conducted and regulated today. What makes Willowbrook particularly chilling is how completely the victims were erased from history. The young women who died in Fitzgerald's experimental chambers, who survived with permanently damaged minds, who lost their essential selves to procedures designed to make them more socially acceptable. Their names, their stories, their humanity have been systematically forgotten by a society that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. The conspiracy of silence that protected Willowbrook's secrets reveals how easily systematic abuse can be hidden when it serves the interests of powerful institutions. Families protected their reputations, medical schools protected their curricula, government officials protected social stability. Everyone had reasons to forget what had happened, except the victims who had lost the capacity to remember or speak for themselves. This pattern of institutional amnesia continues to operate today. How many contemporary atrocities remain hidden behind walls of professional courtesy, legal protections, and social pressure to avoid uncomfortable revelations? How often do we participate in collective forgetting because remembering would require us to acknowledge our own complicity in systems that prioritize order over justice? The young women who entered Willowbrook Academy seeking education and emerged as broken shadows of their former selves deserve more than historical footnotes in sealed archives. Their suffering demands that we examine our own willingness to trust authority without question, to value compliance over authenticity, to sacrifice individual humanity for collective comfort. Perhaps most importantly, Willowbrook reminds us that the capacity for systematic evil doesn't require exceptional cruelty. It only requires ordinary people making reasonable-seeming decisions within systems that have abandoned moral accountability. Dr. Fitzgerald's crimes were enabled by parents seeking help for troubled daughters, physicians advancing medical knowledge, officials maintaining social stability, and communities preferring not to ask difficult questions about institutions they wanted to trust. The true horror of Willowbrook Academy lies not in the surgical procedures conducted in its basement chambers, but in the ease with which an entire society collaborated in erasing the evidence of those crimes. The systematic destruction of memory that Fitzgerald inflicted on her victims was replicated on a larger scale by institutions and families who chose forgetting over justice, silence over truth. As we confront our own era's challenges with institutional abuse, scientific ethics, and social control, the ghosts of Willowbrook's victims whisper urgent warnings about the price of willful ignorance. Their stolen memories, their destroyed personalities, their erased identities serve as monuments to what we lose when we prioritize respectability over humanity, authority over evidence, comfort over truth. The question that haunts us across the decades since Willowbrook's exposure is whether we have learned anything from its terrible lessons or whether we continue to enable systematic abuse through the same combination of misplaced trust, willful blindness, and institutional protection that allowed Dr. Helena Fitzgerald to operate her chamber of horrors for years without meaningful challenge. In remembering Willowbrook Academy, we honor not just its victims, but our obligation to remain vigilant against the systematic dehumanization that masquerades as progress, the institutional evil that hides behind professional respectability, and the collective amnesia that allows history's darkest chapters to repeat themselves in new forms. The silence that once protected Willowbrook's secrets must not be allowed to bury its lessons. The cost of forgetting is too high, and the price of willful ignorance is measured in the destroyed lives of those who trusted institutions that valued their compliance more than their humanity.